Welcome to the Aid Market Podcast, where foreign aid partners connect to learn about key funding trends and market insight. The podcast is co-hosted by Aid Connect Data, the pipeline and market intel software for USAID partnering, and Connected International, the leading USAID partnering support consulting firm. Now, here's your host, Mike Shanley.
Welcome to the Aid Market Podcast. Today we have Ambassador Cindy Courville, the first U.S. ambassador to the African Union, former special assistant to the president and senior director for African Affairs at the National Security Council, where she helped craft U.S. policy towards Africa, and a fellow Joseph Corbell School of International Studies graduate. She holds an MA and a PhD from University of Denver's Corbell School. Ambassador, thank you very much for taking some time to join us today on the show to share your insight into global development and security.
Well, Mike, it's my pleasure. I'm so excited that, as a Corbell graduate yourself, that we can share and alum these important issues on international relations. And, to let the world know, international relations is your day-to-day. That we are global. The luxury of just being local, international is local.
Thank you. Well, in our prep, we talked about global security. And with your background in both defense and intel and development and diplomacy, could you maybe let's start with what is your view on global security and what does that mean to you?
Thank you. I would define global security as basically regime security, the regime, the government of each country. And that entails the political, the economic, the internal security of that regime, the state, the external security, which means your military capability to protect from external intervention, and then your intelligence component. No matter your regime type, whether you're a democratic regime, a hybrid regime, or an authoritarian regime, those 5 components are key to determining the security of the state and the regime.
And what do you see as the interplay between intelligence and development and in promoting development outcomes and better humanitarian aid responses?
I think they're integral and always have been. It's been a precarious, sometimes position for NGOs to enter into. But let me qualify that intelligence isn't just classified. It's open source. Actually, your best source is the open source. And the eyes and ears of the very brave men and women who contribute, in NGOs is so critical because they get to see the day-to-day interaction. So the old word in quotes spying it's about information. And with the World Wide Web, it is all available. So it's key to say whether, if we're funding the United States government, we're funding HIV, AIDS, and malaria programs in Africa. It was the brilliant work of the people on the ground, the NGOs, who were key to implementing, who interfaced with our military or interfaced with our economic components, USTR, trade. All of these things were critical. How do you get medicine? In Uganda and Rwanda and those areas, people were bringing medicine on bicycles up into the rural areas. So the U.S. government funded bicycles. We gave things that were relevant. So we listened to the NGOs. We listened to most certainly the leadership of the country who were on board with this. So intelligence is not a dirty word. It's how it's used or how it's exploited. That is the concern that people in the, intelligence agencies are equally concerned about. And open source has become such, we knew, but now with the use of computers, and I'm going to put in quotes with a question mark, AI, because I think we have to not let AI control what we read. Human beings have to bring the insight. That is how we interface with the NGOs and governments, not just the United States, the EU, the African Union, in this case, I would say the OAS as well, or the Arab League. All of these, ASEAN, all of these are important.
Well, you touched on the African Union. As we mentioned, you were the first U.S. ambassador to the African Union. Maybe let's start there and then get a bit broader into bilaterals and multilaterals. But could you talk about your experience becoming the first ambassador to the African Union for the U.S. and what your role there was?
Well, we were the United States in my capacity as the special assistant to the president for all of sub-Saharan Africa. The United States was the first country to recognize the transition from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union. And we call that lift in government politics. You don't have to do anything physical, but that letter from the president of the United States saying, we recognize you, then everyone else said, well, my God, if the U.S. is going to be out there, we weren't number 15. So we took the lead. We then, when I was in office there, we made the proposal to create a U.S. representative to the AU in the same way we had a U.S. representative to the EU, to NATO, to the Organization of American States. So that said how much the United States thought of this organization, because prior to that, we did not have official representation to the OAU. So this was a huge political and ideological leap for the United States.
So when you took on the role, how do you get started with the role? I imagine there's not a scope of work that's sent to you right when you get started about here are the tasks. How did you even approach framing what the priorities would be, how you and your team would structure the engagement?
Well, here's the difference from being at NSC where you make the policy to being ambassadors and you implement policy. So I had been fortunate enough to sit in the chair where we design the policies with the interagency process. And so I knew that I could pull that reserve. And so how do we operationalize the very policies? Whether it was on the political front, the economic, or the military security front in terms of deploying, U.S. resources, or resources that were already there that had not yet been utilized by the African Union because of their ability and small staff was somewhat limited to absorb all the resources that were coming in from the United States, the EU, all of those things, entities. So for me, it was pretty clear cut. I knew what the policy was. I had been on the forefront of creating and implementing with the interagency team. So in this case, I was very honored that the President of the United States, picked me because I had not volunteered nor sought the job. I was actually quite happy where I was. But, Condoleezza Rice, Secretary Rice, was actually my classmate at Courville, school. And she said, Cindy, there's only one first out there. And, we believe and the president believes you can do this job. So it was, and I was a known entity to the African presidents. So when I went in, I was very much welcome. One, as of course, the United States, but a face that they knew. So all of the ambassadors actually knew who I was before I got there.
You talked about policy there. I'd be interested to hear at the time, what were the policy priorities? And then over the years since, are those still the primary U.S. priorities for the engagement with the African continent? Or which of those have changed and which ones have stayed the same?
Oh, thank you for asking that. On the policy side, the priorities, because we had two things going. We had Sudan going on. We had Somalia. So we had clear-cut policies of engagement and resources that were there that had not yet been fully absorbed by the African Union. I was very fortunate. You talked about interagency. Africa Command was on my watch too when I was at NSC. So I knew I could utilize. So Africa Command gave me 2 military liaisons in the embassy, because when I got there was nothing. We were literally starting from scratch. And State Department was wonderful. Ambassador Yamamoto was the ambassador to Ethiopia, and he and I had worked closely together in Washington when he was in the Africa Department. So I was lucky there was a network in play. General Ward was the first, U.S. combatant commander, and worked seamlessly. Hoa, which was in Djibouti. So there was that kind of eyes and ears and interfacing, and we were able during both Sudan and with Somalia to have our liaisons embedded into the AU, which was a remarkable feature. Not that we were telling anybody what to do, but we could say how we work and how to best utilize our resources. Very fortunate, too, when you talked about we've had observer status. There were all of the other non-African countries had observer status. There was a group there where we met and we could coordinate our resources. And so it really, there was no one person doing it, but a team of people who worked closely together.
And over time, have the priorities changed, or have you seen been there a consistency in U.S. priorities in their policy with the African Union and the African continent?
I would say during the Trump years, Africa was not even on the radar. So fortunately, at the lower levels of government, the civil servants and the people who fortunately we have, who are the continuity for any government, kept things moving. If they were managed to not lose resources, that's a win, because you never know. But this was the first time that we had a lull. The Obama administration carried things right through, attempted to at least, if not maintain the resources we had, to increase. So I would say whether it was Republican or Democrat, we had that continuity. And, when I worked at the NSC, I was not a political appointee. I was a detailed civil servant. And so I saw an administration, and this is where bipartisanship or multipartisanship can be such a wonderful thing, that it didn't matter what party a president was, the policies came first. That's the hallmark of democracy. But when we got into the Bush years, the derogatory statements made about African leaders from the former president, good thing Africans are patient with us, and, hopefully this too shall pass. And even the most authoritarian of them knew this was not a good situation. So they recognize a democratic United States is critical to global security. So policies, the economic, the malaria policies, the HIV/AIDS, the girls' scholarships, which are so important. Would love to see even more money there, but the money that we had made a difference. And the NGOs on the ground were great at helping us target where the needs are and working closely with our embassies. So this symbiotic relationship with our partners in the EU as well, or we could say to the OAS, or we could say to the Arab League, we can only do this based on our policies. Can you take up the slack in another area? That is when you have that global, security working together.
And how important was that geopolitical signal of appointing you and the U.S. taking the lead and appointing you as the first U.S. ambassador to the African Union, presumably ahead of nations like China, engaging with them? What did that mean to the African leaders?
It was an amazing signal to them. And, and because of the job that I had before, I had interfaced with most of them in preparing for meetings. And as the special assistant to the president, they were gracious enough I was not their peer, but gracious enough to engage with me. So one has to understand, I was not elected or seized power. That respect for the country and the message we brought. And while they might have differed on us with issues like, some might call it an invasion, some might say an intervention into Iraq, but they understood. And so that was so important. And they understood at the time President George W. Bush was the first 2 years, met with 25 African heads of state in his office, which was huge. And we did regional meetings. We didn't do the large group. President Obama brought all of them together. President Bush, towards the end, we thought about it. But as he said, he liked deliverables. You should not have a meeting for meeting's sake. So we knew if we were going to have a meeting, what were the issues we were going to address? Is there a policy relevant to it, or do we need to develop one? And that what were deliverables? And deliverables meant what appropriation did you have? Because policy without appropriation is no policy. It just sounds good.
And I'd like to get a bit more into that in interagency, but first, with the Biden administration, have you seen them building on that foundation of engagement with African nations, African leaders, the private sector partners on the continent?
Yes, fortunately, I've seen the return to the level of engagement that you started with Bush and Obama, and so I am very, very pleased to see that Africa is still being brought back as a national security priority. I think that's fundamentally important. AFRICOM is important. The Africa Center for Strategic Studies, most certainly for our leadership role as an observer at the AU, they've maintained that level of engagement. A little more challenging than both the Bush and the Obama administration had. We don't have a Congress, a bipartisan Congress, that is focused and willing to appropriate resources. So unfortunately, I see that to some extent, the hands of the Biden administration have been tied because Congress has failed to, and I will use the word in quotes, failed to do what it needs to do, in particularly the House of Representatives, to fund. Now, they were looking to cut as much funding as possible to PEPFAR, the president's special, on malaria and HIV/AIDS, which has made not just a difference to Africa, but the world. This was the pandemic. I am old enough that was teaching at Occidental College when HIV/AIDS was on the rise in Los Angeles, and to watch dear friends die and were afraid to be touched. And then to see that, hard-nosed, and he's changed directions, President Museveni was one of the biggest champions of addressing AIDS in a positive way, not the way he's turned around now and dealing with the whole, lesbian, LGBTQ community, which is a sad commentary. And maybe we haven't engaged with him enough to pull him around. There's a phrase that you need to hug them tight when they're moving and the others are. So the United States, I saw most certainly through Bush, Obama, hugging the Africans tight. It isn't about beating people up. It's about having the conversation ongoing at all levels, from the lowest level at the local with our NGO partners, reflecting the policy and message, to our ambassadors, to our regional engagement with them, as well as directly from White House. And Congress at that point, when those administrations were there, even though we had differences, we had a core mission and a core outcome.
So under the previous administration, as you mentioned, there was a lack of engagement. And under this administration, maybe policy without appropriations or without sufficient appropriations. Do you think, or are you seeing China or other nations seeing that as an opening to propose their model of development or economic growth or trade? What is your take on the maybe how the current African leaders see the geopolitical options to them in the U.S., China, and other nations.
So that's a great, observation and assessment of that situation. I think right now with the African leaders, and this is not new, they understand that we change leadership every 4 years or every 8 years. And that's part of democracy. And democracy, while wonderful, is messy and extremely fragile. And it's only as good as its people are. And right now, our people, not just the leaders, our people are not at their best. So the African leaders watch that. Now we also have to say, in the historical context, the United States was not there for Africa at the time of decolonization. We supported the colonizers up until, including, at the last bit, Rhodesia and South Africa. We did not support that decolonization. I put it in the historical context. The United States was the first apartheid regime, settler colony. All of the others are modeled after the United States model, including Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Rhodesia, Kenya to a lesser extent. But those are the settler states that last the longest. We should understand better than anyone else, because we overthrew our mother countries to become the nations that we are today. So I will say, in the context, when it came to decolonization, China and Russia were there, and they supported the liberation movements. We did not. The Africans have been extremely forgiving and understanding. I would say extremely democratic in their outlook. So they recognize the dynamics and shifts on a level that the average American just doesn't get. And I'm not just talking the leadership of Africa, but the people themselves. And so you can't expect them not to engage. We engage with all kinds of other folks too, whose reputations are less than stellar. We have to engage with Russia. We have to engage with China and even with North Korea, because that diplomacy becomes the tool that maybe we will turn it around. And so for the Africans, they understand. I'm going to make a gross generalization. They'd rather work with us. Now, sometimes we are not as gracious, because Americans, including myself, we can be a little edgy, a little raw, but Africans are extremely polite, even the most authoritarian of them. And so I think they recognize, and I think they're optimistic and hoping that we turn the corner and stay democratic, because they're watching the signs in our country as well. If we fall, or if we shift to a more authoritarian situation, that is not in the best interest of African countries or developing countries in general. It really isn't in the best interest of China, because who is their market? It's us. And, I will say the Biden administration, in terms of, economic development, has moved forward. We are at a great position in this country, and Africans see it. It's unfortunately the American citizens don't see it. And that hurts my heart, if I have to put it that way.
Well, I'd like to get a little bit more to the work you and some other diplomatic and development leaders are doing in a minute. But I do want to make sure to get your insight on good development and the importance of interagency work. And you talked about policy with appropriations. USAID, the lead agency for U.S. International development. Ambassador, can USAID just lead that development work alone? Or what is the role of other agencies in collaborating to have effective development outcomes that achieve the results they want, that support U.S. foreign policy and create a more prosperous and secure world?
Oh, thank you. USAID is critical. Here's if I were writing the policy for USAID today, or for the administration, not just for Africa, but just in general, I would say we need to, and people are going to cringe, increase the size of USAID. USAID's mission is so huge, but the number of personnel and NGOs are great, but we need more continuity in that process. I mean, to be honest with you, I would, at a minimum, triple the staff. Because while working with the NGOs is great, the NGO's first mission is the NGO's mission, not the US mission. And so, and we need the NGOs to be there, but we need to be able to better orchestrate money and resources to them, to manage that resources, to have accountability. And the men and women of USAID are doing yeoman's work, but not enough people and not enough time and resources to do it. When we created the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the staffing on that was great, but it didn't have the same mission as AID. But here's how they were interrelated in terms of determining whether a country was stable enough politically, economically, socially, as well as on the physical security side as well, because all of those components go together. So AID, in terms of looking at Gaza today, the role that they would play, is totally understaffed to do it. Yes, we need the NGOs, but the future of USAID, and people talk about big government, we are a big country. We need this. Our responsibilities are there. Our stability is also interdependent on the global stability of the world. And like it or not, that's a huge role we play. And sometimes we make mistakes, but if we do come back and rally around. So the healthcare issue on COVID, we missed the boat with the Trump administration. If they had done what, we did with malaria and HIV/AIDS, we could have stopped the spread of this disease enormous.
With that, let's segue to your current work with the National Security Leaders for America. You're on the steering committee. My question would be, what is depending on how the next elections go, both in Congress and for the White House, what is your response or insight to someone that wants to cut development funding or diplomatic funding?
I would say our response is democracy. It is a major tool of democracy. And, NSLA 4 for America believes that democracy is being threatened with our next election. So the kind of leadership we have is fundamentally important. And so for development is a tool that is used by every agency, both state and local government. Development is not just external, it's internal and external. But if you're going to talk about border issues, then what are we doing with our engagement with Mexico and Canada? Mexico's elections were marred by violence and killing of mayoral candidates and gubernatorial candidates. It is in our best national security interest to have a politically economic and secure Mexico. Same thing with Canada. So if Mexico is having problems, then USAID's role there or in Central America is fundamentally important. So we believe that we need to have a democracy and a leadership that is focused on maintaining democracy, not curtailing the rights and freedoms of Americans. And we are bipartisan across the board. And so our focus is on making sure that the candidate who's elected is one who is going to promote American democracy so that we can maintain our role as one of the world's leaders, if not the world's leader on democracy. But we have slipped. If you use the Economist Intelligence Unit assessment, we're now declared a flawed democracy. I think they're being very kind. We're getting closer when the previous administration to becoming a hybrid. And depending on who is elected, we're more likely to go more authoritarian. So you need to take someone's word when they said there'll be a dictator for a day. No one is ever a dictator for a day. And so the rest of the world, and whether it's the Africans or the Latin Americans, they're all cringing. The Europeans know if we go a different direction, that Europe is incredibly vulnerable. and that Russia, Putin had said this from day one, even before he came in the lead. He was upset with Gorbachev when Gorbachev moved to dismantle the Soviet Union. And take a leader at his word. If a leader says, or a candidate says, this is what they're going to do, then you must believe it. So the rest of the world is with bated breath, hoping that democracy is maintained and that this is only a weak moment in our phase. Argentina is, I think, the perfect example of a country who has been every regime type in its history since roughly about 1889, from going to being authoritarian coups, hybrids, democracy, and back and forth. We have done this, and I say I have to give credit to George Washington. Yes, he moved in that direction, but he sacrificed some other things. So this is why I said a settler, apartheid, democratic regime. And then with a constitution with the hope. So people still see the United States as a place where the experiment is ongoing and that it is possible to change course and come back. And so we don't want to follow the path of Argentina because I'm not sure we will rebound quite as quickly. We haven't resolved our Civil War issues, women's issues, all of those things that are fundamentally part of democracy.
Ambassador, given that context, we mentioned we're both graduates of the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. What would you say to someone getting started and that wants to go into the development or diplomatic sector? What should they be doing now? How can they prepare? How can they get their start and build a career in this space?
First of all, I would say your ability to analyze, critical thinking, your ability to write well is so fundamental. If you're going, I started out as a political science major, went to law school for a year, decided that was not my thing, came back, got a master's degree in state and local government, and then made the leap to international relations because my master's thesis was on the politics of desegregation in Louisiana and Lafayette and St. Landry Parish. And so I was looking at how government works. I think it's important to understand how government works and the role of citizens and civilians and, or agencies like USAID at the state level and then at the international. So when I went to Denver, my focus shifted. I mean, that was a quantum leap to make that jump. My dissertation was on Zimbabwe's liberation struggle. And I looked at regime security. So when you hear me talk about the regime components, the things I studied were the things I used in my teaching and refined. In my government work, I served as a political military analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency. My academic training went right into play. The same framework of analysis I used to do my dissertation was the same framework I used as the lead analyst on Angola during the Angolan War. Helped me to understand indicators and warnings of what could happen. You couldn't say it exactly, but this is the patterns, understanding the role of leadership, that if you're looking at the expression, if you're in the military, by the time you see the tanks in position, it is too late. It is at the policy level. So going from a political military analyst to working in the office of the Secretary of Defense as the director for East Africa, was my briefing and my writing that got me into that detailed job. It was the same things that got me into my position detailed to the White House, using those same skills to develop policy and strategy. And even when I was still DOD being detailed to White House, the executive leadership programs, if you can be in programs of opportunities with my colleagues across DOD and the interagency, because we understood we had to work together. For AID to deploy its resources, you might have to have DOD do that. That's not, its mission isn't that, but that is one of its missions. Its primary mission is the protection of the state, but it has secondary missions because the military and the intelligence community recognize the more political and economically stable we are, the less you have to use those other tools. And you only want to use those other tools in the most extreme situations. So the same plan that our team for in the executive leadership program, we developed a plan for creating we wanted to create AFRICOM. And the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is Cindy. We've been trying that for 20 years, not going to happen. So he said, write it up for the subcombatant command. So we wrote a plan for the subcombatant. When I had the opportunity to serve at the White House, I pulled out the plan. Never get rid of a strategy or a plan. And I wrote the proposal in support with the team at state and others. DOD wasn't quite on board, my counterpart there, but they came along later because they didn't see it would be done, and they didn't think the president would say yes. Fortunately, President Bush, first time around, said yes. And then we were told, make it happen. So it takes your president, but it takes the team and the interagency to make it happen, and the funding and the support of Congress, which, we were all working as a team regardless of our partisan interests.
It's great, always great to hear when academic work isn't just academic, but actually is applied to policy. Ambassador, with that, thank you very much for taking the time to share your expertise, your insight, your thoughts with our audience. We really appreciate you coming on the Aid Market podcast today. Thank you again.
Well, thank you, Mike, for the work you do. And as a fellow alum, I hope that we spend more time together.
That would be wonderful. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to the Aid Market Podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and connect with Mike Shanley on LinkedIn to stay updated on the latest USAID funding trends.